So this topic covers the genetics of sex, and we're talking about basically the inheritance of becoming male or female. And we can study that in fruit flies, as you can see here. And what we study in fruit flies and other model organisms can extend, of course, to features about humans. So I feel like it's kind of topical. This is something that people talk about a bit these days, the so-called gender reveal parties. And this is 2021 right now. It's been a pretty busy couple of years for people doing these parties where they get the families together and then they have some kind of grand presentation that shows in blue or pink whether they know they're having a boy or a girl, right? So some of these have become rather infamous for starting fires and so on. People do this with explosives and in really dramatic fashion that are dangerous, as you can see from a couple of these headlines. And we've also, as you'll see on the next slide, we've had a conversation that's a lot more relevant these days about sex and gender. So I'll mention that on the next slide, but just at the start of this, I believe this term gender reveal party is something that's more familiar to people. And of course, it's here on the headlines. So we talk about basically knowing what sex, whether that child is going to be male or female. We can know that ahead of time using a variety of tools before the birth happens. So that's why they have the parties, and that's why people get at risk from having one of these parties. All right. So what is the deal with sex and gender? I think it's probably useful to track over to an authority on this, the World Health Organization. As I mentioned, sex and gender, they're kind of more relevant topics these days. We're having conversations that we didn't have before about gender identity and so on. So from the perspective of a biology course, we're going to cover sex. And I think in some respects, people are nervous to use the word. It's one of those, sort of taboo words from your childhood. But it's really the best word to use to refer to whether an organism is male or female. So as it says here, sex, the biological and physiological characteristics that make a person a man or a woman. Again, mostly we're talking about humans, but also if we use this term sex, we can extend that out into animals and even other organisms, as we'll see. This concept of gender, some people, a lot of our students tend to prefer gender. It's a softer word. It doesn't kind of get people, it's not quite so offensive, I guess, in a few contexts. But it's not quite the right word to talk about strictly being male or female. So gender is a lot more of a human issue where humans can have a gender identity that may or may not track with their biological sex. So we're going to leave gender in the subject of other courses for this time being and talk about sex. So as I mentioned, sex is something that we can determine in humans. In other mammals, of course, would be very similar to how sex is determined in humans, but we can extend out into more and more distantly related organisms. So in the fruit flies, we're going to study sex chromosomes and sex inheritance that is a lot like, looks a lot like it does in humans. We use similar terminology. But this concept of sex is really much more widespread across life. So the idea that something is male and something is female goes back to the division of gametes into large immobile egg cells. Those are sort of the target and end up being in the resource, the larger resource cell in the process of fertilization. And then the sperm, the male competition, the male component is smaller cells, more numerous, and the job of the sperm cells is to find and sort of compete for access to the egg cells. And what I've described there is probably familiar to you from humans, but it's also very similar kind of strategies that we see in plants and other organisms. So there are plants that have single sex, and they have there are actually some plants that have swimming sperm cells and similar few large egg cells that are the target of the sperm cells. And the common ancestor, you would have to go very far back to find the common ancestor of humans and plants, the common ancestor does not have that same sex determination. So this is an independent origin of split into male, female, sex, into sperm and egg in plants versus humans. And just from convenience and really highlighting this convergent evolution on a useful theme, we use the same terms, sperm and egg and male and female. We use those across these kingdoms of life. So some examples here showing the different parts of a plant called ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba is native to Eastern Asia and grown commonly as an ornamental tree. There's some on campus. And it has a split into male plants and female plants. So on the left here, this is the male component of this plant. It's actually a gymnosperm, so it's related to pine trees more than it is to flowering plants. Although maybe the jury's out on that one. Very distantly related to flowering plants. And then this one is the female plant producing early stage structures that are going to develop into these fleshy seeds that it has. And so I decided to pull this up as a kind of out there example of something that's probably less familiar to you. And nonetheless, there's this region they're talking about, a sex determining region, genomic architecture. So these are genetic components that determine whether a plant becomes male or female. Not only that, but they are involved in the chances, the odds that a particular mating is going to result in a male or a female. And so all of this is kind of wrapped up in this concept of sex. Like I said, very involved process. This is a little bit highlight from that study showing, again, one of those genome scale investigations into where in the genome among these 12 chromosomes are sites that are more cleanly distinguishing males and females. And so there's a big region here on the second chromosome for that. So I guess maybe relative to what we were just talking about with that second chromosome and looking for the sex determination, it's not always a sex chromosome sex determination system. It is that way in mammals. And so this is, we're going to kind of come in from the familiar topic here. So mammals have chromosomes, our 23rd set of chromosomes. We have 23 sets overall. The numbering system goes up to 22 with numbers, and then the 23rd set are these sex chromosomes. And the sex chromosomes are different depending on whether you're a male or a female. Again, biological sex. So biological males have homologous chromosomes that are a Y and an X, or we typically call them XY. And females have 2 of the X chromosome. And so what is it that determines that? Well, it turns out that basically inheriting the Y chromosome allows a male to inherit the instructions for becoming a male. So there's a region on the Y chromosome called the SRY gene, and that stands for the sex determining region on the Y chromosome. And it's a gene, and basically having that gene turns you into a male, and not having that gene turns you into a female during the process of development. So as you might suspect, males get a Y from their fathers. So that's a male to male transmission. And males who are XY, they get their X from their mothers, who has 2X to give. So a little more detail about this. This illustrates a little bit about how we confirmed that the SRY gene is so important for sex determination. And this is a classic genetic experiment where you have something, a genetic element, a gene that you think has or causes a result, and you take away the gene, see what you get. And they also have a case where they added the gene artificially. So in the center here is a normal situation where the SRY gene in red here is present on the Y chromosome. Through a lab modification, they can take that kind of genetic makeup and remove the SRY gene. So on the right side here, this is an individual that has all of the genetics of a normal male, except it's missing the SRY. So it's got everything else. And taking away that SRY was enough to cause that male not to develop as a male, but instead to develop as a female. And then the counterpoint to that on the other side is you could take this SRY gene out of the Y chromosome, artificially add it to the X chromosome, and the individuals who have that genetic makeup would develop as males. So this is a mostly XX male with an added SRY gene, and then a XY female just with the Y missing the SRY gene. So definitely a most important genetic determinant of maleness or femaleness. So back to these gender reveal parties, typically people find out the sex of their babies through an ultrasound where they assess the external features of the fetus. But you can also do a genetic investigation. So this is one looking for the presence of the SRY gene, and what it shows basically in these triangles that I've highlighted are that females, in whatever DNA sample you take from the females, they have no signal whatsoever for an SRY gene. And males, I don't know how significant this scale is, but males have at least some. So they have some indication of this SRY present on their Y chromosome. So you could, as this title indicates, you could determine the sex of a baby using genetic means, not just looking at the features of the fetus. All right, so I mentioned that going way back, there's not a common origin for biological sex, and there's not a widespread or common use of sex chromosomes across organisms. This is very convenient that this very distantly related organism to us, the fruit fly, has chromosomes that we can call X and Y. So they get called X and Y. It's sort of a convention, sort of an analogous situation where they function similarly, and we can study them to learn principles about sex inheritance and so on. But the common ancestor of humans and fruit flies did not have the same kind of sex chromosomes. I believe it would not actually have sex chromosomes if you go far enough back. One term they use for this is to call the males are the heterogametic sex. The term is heterogametic. Hetero for different and gametic for gametes. So if a male is has X and Y, then in the production of gametes, I guess I'll make this familiar to you if you've had, if you remember your study of meiosis. That process produces an even number of X and Y containing gametes. And so hetero, different kinds of gametes. So half of the gametes produced by an XY male have the X chromosome, half of the gametes have the Y chromosome. And females, by contrast, are homogametic, where they have the XX, and I won't draw out the gametes, but as you can imagine, when it comes to passing on a sex chromosome, they have to give an X to their offspring. So humans, males are heterogametic, fruit flies, males are heterogametic. So nice equivalent study there. Here's an example of a pretty large group that has a sort of a complete reversal of the heterogametic sex. So again, the common ancestor of mammals and birds is way back in time. And turns out that modern birds have this sex determination where their heterogametic sex is actually the female. So by convention, they get a little bit different notation. They get called Z and W for their X chromosomes, so as not to confuse them with the X and Y form of inheritance. So males are ZZ, females are ZW. And it really doesn't matter necessarily what the chromosomes look like, as long as the inheritance and the chance of producing males and females is adaptive for that species. So typically we get an even ratio of males and females, 50% of each, and then an equal match when it comes to mating and breeding and producing the next generation. So I've given you a few hints here about the various ways that organisms can have their sex determined. You don't need to know the details about this, but it is a wild world out there when it comes to sex determination. So looking over in mammals, And birds, as we've talked, mammals, as it says here, have this XY system. Birds in the blue have this ZW system, and lots of other systems. So homomorphic sex chromosomes, that means that the sex chromosomes would look the same. GSD, genetic sex determination. ESD, environmental sex determination. So you might have heard about that in crocodilians. Depending on the temperature of their environment, they can develop into males or females. And then over here, we got some plant-specific categories. So it's kind of a wide variety of not only how males and females can be genetically determined, but even how a single plant might express its maleness or femaleness. So for example, a lot of flowers have male and female components in the same flower. It gets a little complicated in plants. I'd love to talk to you about it if you're ever curious about that. All right, so back to mammals. We're going to mostly deal with this form of sex inheritance. So mammals and then the analog to this inheritance that we see in fruit flies. So I mentioned the ratios, sort of the optimal ratios of producing offspring. And you can see that in the genetics of a cross. If you do a cross between a male and a female, what's the chance of a male offspring? So a mating requires a male parent and a female parent. And basically you could take those gametes that we determined and build them into a Punnett square. The male contribution is an X or a Y in equal chance. The female contribution is always an X. And so female always gives an X. If the male also transmits an X to the offspring, it becomes female. If the male transmits a Y to the offspring, then it becomes male. So under this set of expectations, we would expect 50% of the offspring to be conceived, to be fertilized and develop as males, 50% to develop as females. So another interesting topic, we understand sex inheritance pretty well, at least in these model organisms and mammals. There's other features you can look at that involve the other genes on these heterogametic chromosomes. So there's a topic called sex linkage that we'll spend some time on here. It refers to genes that are linked, as in physically associated with the X chromosome. So let me spell it out here for us. A sex-linked gene that is physically, I think I'll just keep it kind of simple here for this, physically located on a sex chromosome. And for all the examples we use, we're going to run into cases where this is usually on the X chromosome. A few ways to think about this. One way to think about that is that it needs to be on the X if it's any kind of gene that both males and females need. Putting it on the Y chromosome would mean that only males have a chance to get that gene. So that's one of the reasons why sex linkage usually refers to genes located on the X chromosome. So the first evidence for sex-linked genes came from fruit flies that we've seen a lot of examples from already. And this is kind of the simplest version of the results that were obtained from this kind of cross. So these white-eyed fruit flies, if you cross a white-eyed fruit fly by a wild-type fruit fly, if the white-eyed fruit fly was a female, then she produces offspring that are both red-eyed and white-eyed, and about half of each. If you have a white-eyed male crossed by a wild-type female, that causes all the offspring to have red eyes. So this is a good case why it's useful to have reciprocal crosses. So we set those up in lab to do males and females with the different starting genotypes to see if there's any difference in how male offspring or female offspring inherit the results. So one way to look at these is you can look at the genotypes, and I recommend writing your genotypes. If you have a gene that's located on the X chromosome, write the genotype so that the gene or the allele that you're looking at is written as a superscript on the X chromosome. So females are XX. A white-eyed female would have 2X, and each of those X has a little W allele, giving you the wild-type phenotype. Males have only one X, so this wild-type male is going to have the W plus allele, but only on his X chromosome. Here we have it reversed. Female with 2 X's, both with the wild-type allele, male with only one X, and it has the recessive W allele. So you can see how, based on how these are inherited, the male offspring can get a different arrangement than the female offspring. So let me see if I can spell it out here for us. So the male, as I said, the male determines the sex of the offspring. Oops, I'm sorry. I knew I was missing something. So put them in order there. So the male's W plus is the dominant allele, and then ends up being the first X here. And then the female is giving a little W to all of the offspring. So the female offspring get an X from the wild type male parent, and that W plus that he gives allows that to have the wild type red eye phenotype. But a male offspring of this fly gets his Y and only gets one X from mom, which has the recessive little W allele. Let's see if I can spell this a little bit out here. In the other example, the reciprocal cross, the male is donating either a recessive allele or a Y chromosome, and the female donates wild type alleles to everybody. So all of the offspring of this right-hand cross get to be either heterozygous for W plus, or this situation we call hemizygous for W plus. So you get a different outcome depending on whether the sex of the male and the female parents and the sex of the offspring. So not only in this left-hand example, not only do we see half and half red and white, but all the red-eyed offspring are female and all the white-eyed offspring are male. All right, so I mentioned this term. This is called hemizygous. Hemi means half, and males that get only one of their X chromosomes, they should not be described as being homozygous or heterozygous. Those are terms referring to something where you have a couple of alleles. So they're hemizygous one at a time, sort of a half genotype. If they get the recessive allele, they show the recessive phenotype. That's going to become important. If they get the dominant allele, they show the dominant phenotype. Females, on the other hand, can have homozygous recessive genotypes. So this would cause a white-eyed female, as we saw. And then wild-type eye color can happen if the female is homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So one of the interesting patterns with these sex-linked, X-linked genes is that males tend to show the recessive phenotype a lot more, because all it takes is one allele in a male, and that male would show the recessive phenotype. All right, so here's an example we can work out. Let's say we cross a heterozygous female by a hemizygous dominant male. Any interesting results here? So 2 kinds of X from mom, she's heterozygous, 2 kinds of sex chromosome from dad, and XW plus, XW plus, XW plus, XW, XW plus Y, XW, Y. So everybody across the top is a female. I've been using these male-female symbols. Hopefully you're familiar with those. All the female offspring are red-eyed or wild type, either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. The males can have red eyes if they get mom's W plus allele. Oops, that's not a male symbol. Male symbol. Or half of the males are going to have white eyes because they would get the recessive allele from mom and the Y from dad. So one of the real hallmarks for sex linkage is that males and females have different inheritance patterns. We don't see any white-eyed females from this cross, and half of the males have white eyes in this cross. Okay, so I mentioned we often see these phenotypes, the recessive phenotype showing up in males more, and also that these traits are more often on the X chromosome, so genes on the X chromosome. As for the reason I mentioned before, that both males and females have X and only males have Y. And another reason in humans anyway, the Y chromosome is rather small, so it doesn't have the same kind of the same real estate to be able to put some genes on there. It's a feature that sometimes happens with sex chromosomes, that it's been reduced in size because its job is mostly to carry that SRY gene. So you can see some X-linked genes that are highlighted on this illustration. So ocular albinism, muscular dystrophy, hemophilia, and so on. And there's color blindness down here at the bottom. This is one of the more commonly inherited X-linked genes. Again, color blindness a little more prevalent in males. So in the center of the slide here, this is one of the tests for color blindness. If you are colorblind, you would have difficulty seeing there's a number that's in circles that are of a different color, and you can kind of make out a number. I think I have pretty normal vision. I have trouble seeing that exactly, but a person who is colorblind would have, I think, probably no chance of telling that there's a number in there. At least certain kinds of color blindness. All right, so I mentioned the color blindness here. These are the finer details of color blindness, if you're curious. So it turns out that we have three big color receptor genes. One's located on chromosome 7 there, the short wavelength light. So these are named OPN1 and then SW, short wavelength, middle wavelength, long wavelength. These are features of the visible light spectrum, and they absorb different colors. So short wavelength leads in more towards the blue and purple end of the spectrum, as it shows there. Middle wavelength closer to more like a green, and then long wavelength heading out towards the red and orange part of the spectrum. So being able to receive these three kinds of color gives us the three kinds of color that people can perceive. Most people, I guess I should say. And this is, I find this is interesting. It's related to, if you're into like electronic color depictions or print media or something, you can basically give humans a color they can see by combining features of redness, blueness, and greenness all together. So RGB is often called sort of a shorthand for the color scale on a computer. And that's made up of red, green, and blue. And these are sort of the reference points of the normal human color perception. And they more or less correspond to these different proteins. So being able to absorb long wavelength light allows you to see red, not necessarily see red so much, but be able to tell the difference between red and green. That's one of the hallmarks of color blindness, is not being able to distinguish some colors that other people can. It all comes back around, right? Okay, so I mentioned lots of genes on the X chromosome. What is going on with the Y chromosome? Well, it's small and doesn't have too much of genetic information on there that's, I guess, noteworthy. I haven't seen much about Y-linked genes. But one thing that the Y chromosome is useful for is genealogy studies. So if you ever submit your DNA and you want to find out where your family is from, if you are a male, you'll probably get a Y chromosome investigation where they'll try to match you up with known Y chromosomes. And the important thing here is that the Y chromosome is basically inherited entirely from father to son. So it doesn't have a chance of crossing over, a feature we'll see in meiosis. Just the whole thing is inherited. And so genetically, whatever features you have on your Y chromosome should be exactly or almost exactly what your father gave you. And that would be what his father gave him. His father gave him, and so on, all the way up the male line. So father to son to son to son to son to son is all passing down this Y chromosome. And any changes on there are the result of mutations that happen during somebody's lifetime or in between growing up and passing on the next line of gametes. And here's my interesting application for the Y chromosome. This is one form of genealogy that was highlighted in a paper shown here. This was a Y chromosome study that determined, maybe reinforced something that people already knew, that a whole bunch of Eurasia, males in Eurasia, a lot of them have very similar genetic makeup, similar Y chromosomes. And so what's going on here? Well, it turns out that this gentleman who's depicted up here, Genghis Khan, was a major feature in the, you can see down here, the 1200s and so on, 13th century. So it moved across Eurasia, conquering people, killing males of the places where he was conquering, and also leaving behind a little bit of a genetic legacy. So not just Genghis Khan, but Genghis Khan and his generals basically is how it shakes out. So there's a few of these clusters, as it says, this descent cluster of basically a few people who have had a really large number of offspring. So they had sons and their sons had sons. And so they've disproportionately kind of flooded the Y chromosome market here with their Y chromosome. So I've heard tell of, I forget what the number is, but something like 10% of this part of the world is directly descended from Genghis Khan or his generals. So you can learn a lot about your Y chromosome. Females don't want you to feel left out. So there's a bit of a female-specific inheritance also. And that has to do with the relative size difference in egg cells and sperm cells. So egg cells are much larger, as you can see here. Egg cell, big green thing, sperm cell, much smaller. So the relative contribution of cytoplasm to the zygote that'll happen after fertilization is mostly coming from the egg and not so much coming from the sperm. And what that means for inheritance is we often think about it being basically that sperm cells don't contribute mitochondria. Mitochondria have their own DNA. And basically, as a result of this size difference, you have mitochondria that you got from your mother. So mothers pass down mitochondria to all of their children. There's some exceptions, but we kind of simplify it down to most of the time. Fathers give Y to their sons, and mothers give a mitochondrion to all of their kids. This little illustration here, this is a plant example just showing male versus female. In plants, there would also be this chloroplast indicated by the CP of these green circles. And the fertilization, the resulting zygote results from cellular components, these so-called cytoplasmic components of chloroplast and mitochondrion that have their own DNA inherited from the egg cell. And then the nucleus is most of the genetic diversity made up of a combination of the male gamete and the female gamete. So mitochondria can have also genetic diseases. And if a person has a mitochondrial disease, as they call it, this can be something that affects the person And if that's a person is a woman, then that's the only kind of mitochondrion she can pass on to her offspring. Until there was this intervention. So a new technique exists, and I believe it's gained a lot of speed, that a woman who has mitochondrial disease can get one of these so-called 3-parent embryos produced. And so the red parents here, these are the couple who are hoping to have a baby, and they produce a fertilized egg. So fertilized egg here, I don't know if that's quite indicated there. Fertilized egg would be the zygote. And what they do is they take the nucleus out of that, which has most of the genetic information for making a person, and they combine it with somebody else's cytoplasm. So there's a donor egg that's got cytoplasm, including mitochondria. And those would have, as it says, they're healthy mitochondria that could replace the parent mother's, her own mitochondria. So something they can do in the laboratory and basically overcome if any part of the mitochondrion is not functioning normally, or has abnormal genetics, they can be basically replaced. So there's not a lot of genes on the mitochondrion, but genetic issues, mutations in those genes can have big effect, as we'll see. It is possible for a woman to have different kinds of mitochondria, and more common than I would have thought. So this number 0 to 10, certainly women also would have 0% of different mitochondria, but then up to 10% of cells contain genetically different mitochondria. So during the course of a woman's development, mutations can arise, and some of those may change the form of mitochondria, mutate some of the genes that are present there. And depending on the relative proportions, this is just an illustration of, say, all the mitochondria that a woman has to give to her egg cells. If they're different, then they could basically take a sample of those mitochondria, and some end up in different proportions. You got some with a little more blue and a little more goldenrod here, and those might have a phenotype effect on the offspring. So 0 to 10%, and also as a woman gets older, there's increased chance that she will have some of these mitochondrial differences. So you can use these patterns of inheritance. We saw the track of the Y chromosome inheritance of father to son to son to son to son. Cytoplasmic inheritance in a natural situation goes from mother, so would go from mother to all of her children, but only the females would pass it on to their children. So basically the mitochondrial DNA can track the mother to daughter to daughter to daughter to daughter pattern. So we get these two independent perspectives on, if you want to look at a whole civilization or culture, we can look and kind of confirm that the Y chromosome pattern of the males is the same pattern for the cytoplasm, the mitochondria of the females, and basically is. So across these human populations around the world, you can trace the genetic similarity of people in different parts of the world. So this is a fun set of data that has been spearheaded a little bit by the National Geographic organization. And they basically took genetic data from people who live in parts of the world whose ancestors have always been there. So as far as anybody can remember, the people they sample in South America are descended from people who have always been in South America, and so on. But of course, people were not always spread throughout the whole world. So you can trace back tens of thousands of years in the past, track human migration, people who are descended from ancient migrating populations that migrated together would have more similar DNA. And then other people who are, say, more distantly related would have farther back ancestors, indicating that they might have come over at different times. So these two, this Q lineage in gray and the C lineage in dark red, both people native to North America, but The C lineage has closer relatives in people from Southeast Asia, whereas the Q lineage has people more closely related from Northern Eurasia and a long back further in time. Um, and then this also confirms what we have from archaeological evidence as far as the timing of when people showed up in different parts of the world, and ultimately the origin of the human species, which goes back, the oldest of these branching events goes back to Africa, as we well know from the fossil evidence.